In 1931, before Lucky Luciano became the quiet architect of modern organized crime, there was a single night the world was never meant to witness, a night when the man who controlled entire neighborhoods was forced to stand still while a white police officer reduced him to nothing in front of strangers. It wasn't the shove that marked him. It wasn't the search. It wasn't even the words meant to humiliate him. It was the silence he chose while the city watched. A silence so controlled, so calculated, that it frightened the few who understood what it truly meant. Because men like Luciano didn't break when they were pushed. They evolved. And what began as a simple humiliation on a wet Manhattan street soon became the spark that would dismantle an entire old order, reshape an empire from the inside, and change the Mafia forever. Most people remember what Luciano built. Very few know what almost broke him, and why he allowed it to happen. The night holds the answer, and Manhattan remembers everything. To understand how a single insult rewrote the underworld, we must return to the moment the rain stopped falling. Manhattan, 1931. Night did not simply fall over the city. It settled, heavy and deliberate, as though it were claiming each street for itself. The rain had passed moments earlier, but its presence lingered in the sheen that coated the pavement. Reflections trembled in the shallow pools of water. Lamps flickering, silhouettes drifting, the distant pulse of a world that refused to sleep. The camera glides through narrow alleys, past brick walls stained with decades of smoke, past metal fire escapes that look like cages suspended in midair. Behind shuttered doors, the soft clinking of glasses can be heard. Speakeasies thriving beneath layers of whispered deals and unspoken debts. The Prohibition era had turned Manhattan into a cathedral of secrets, and every secret had its own price. The narrator's voice emerges, low and composed, as if speaking from behind a veil. In this city, everyone moves, but very few understand the game they're part of. A figure appears in the shimmering reflection long before he steps into frame. His stride is steady, unhurried, a pace belonging to someone who shapes the world around him rather than reacts to it. When he finally emerges beneath the street lamp, the details sharpen, a perfectly tailored suit, a fedora angled with quiet precision, gloves smoothing the edges of a man who never left anything to chance. Lucky Luciano. His expression is unreadable, a polished surface that reveals nothing and absorbs everything. He walks through the night not as a participant, but as an architect, a man who studies the movements of others the way a chess master studies a board. Around him, Manhattan vibrates with invisible tensions. White police officers patrol in pairs, their eyes scanning the faces of immigrants with suspicion sharpened by the era. Italian shopkeepers shutter their businesses early, weary of raids disguised as routine checks. African-American musicians sneak through back doors to reach clubs that would deny them at the front. Every corner holds a story of power, prejudice, or survival. Tonight, the current beneath the city feels different, thicker, darker, as if something is waiting to surface. The air itself seems to anticipate a fracture, a moment capable of reshaping the delicate balance that holds the underworld together. Before he became the architect of modern organized crime, Lucky Luciano was humiliated, in plain sight, for all to witness. A single breath hangs in the cold night air. The story is about to begin. The rain had settled into the cracks of Mulberry Street, leaving thin silver veins glistening beneath the dim glow of street lamps. It was late enough for the neighborhood to be quiet, but not late enough for it to sleep. The air carried the usual mixture of garlic from restaurant kitchens, tobacco from doorways, and the faint metallic scent of the city's unrest. Lucky Luciano stepped out of a small Sicilian restaurant, a place where the waiters knew his preferences without needing to ask, where silence was the currency and respect was the atmosphere. He adjusted his cuffs with deliberate calm, his coat resting on his shoulders like a cloak of quiet authority. Beside him, the city's pulse throbbed in a slow, steady rhythm. That rhythm broke the moment the policeman appeared. A white officer, tall, broad-shouldered, with a jaw clenched tight enough to crack stone. He wasn't a stranger to the neighborhood. Everyone knew his type. A man who saw immigrants not as citizens, but as intruders who needed to be reminded of their place. He carried himself with the smugness of someone who believed the badge on his chest gave him moral immunity. He stepped directly into Luciano's path. "Empty your pockets," the officer barked, his voice echoing down the narrow street. There was no cause, no accusation, just a command, delivered loudly enough to draw the attention of bystanders lingering in the doorways, smoking their last cigarettes, or sweeping the remnants of the day off their steps. Luciano paused, not out of fear, but out of calculation. The officer didn't wait. He grabbed Luciano by the arm, turning him abruptly as if he were nothing more than a street delinquent. His hands moved roughly, patting him down without care, pushing, prodding, searching for something he knew he would never find. Luciano stood still, his posture straight, his breathing slow. Not a single protest escaped his lips. The verbal humiliation came next. Barbed comments disguised as law enforcement, delivered with the eagerness of a man who enjoyed his own cruelty. "Funny how you immigrants walk around here like you own the place," the cop muttered, leaning closer. "Must be hard pretending to be important when everyone knows you're just another outsider." A few people watched, and that, more than the shove, more than the search, was the deepest cut. Humiliation is never about the act itself. It is about the audience. He did not respond. He did not threaten. He did not raise his voice. Lucky Luciano simply listened and measured the moment. In that silence, something shifted. A thread was pulled. A balance was broken. The officer walked away smirking, convinced he had won. But Luciano's eyes followed him with the calm of a man already imagining the blueprint of a different ending. In that instant, Luciano's silence spoke louder than any retaliation. Long before the newspapers whispered his name with equal doses of fear and fascination, Charles Lucky Luciano had already learned the one principle that would define the rest of his life. Power belonged not to the man who struck hardest, but to the one who waited longest. His childhood in the narrow, sunless corners of the Lower East Side had carved this lesson into him early, shaping a mind that understood danger not as something to avoid, but as something to study. He had grown from street fights to backroom deals, from petty survival to calculated ascension. There was charm in him, an ease, a warmth almost. But beneath that surface lay an intellect sharpened by necessity. He knew how to read people by the way they lit a cigarette, by the pause before they answered, by the twitch of a brow they tried to hide. To him, every gesture was a clue, every conversation, a negotiation. Where others in the underworld clung to the old ways, impulsive violence, honor tangled with ego, loyalty sworn with knives instead of foresight, Luciano observed their methods with a detached kind of clarity. He saw the waste in their anger, the short lifespan of their ambitions. To him, rage was a luxury, emotion was a trap. Decisions made in the heat of the moment were as fragile as glass. He built his influence the same way an architect designs a cathedral, slowly, stone by stone, with attention to foundations no one else bothered to reinforce. Those who underestimated him rarely did so twice. His silence unsettled them. His politeness disarmed them. His patience unnerved them more than any bullet ever could. The humiliation he endured on Mulberry Street was not, in his mind, an affront to his pride. It was a revelation, an invitation, a reminder that even a man as careful as he was could be tested in the open, stripped of dignity before strangers who would whisper about it long after the scene dissolved into the wet pavement. But unlike the old guard, he did not burn with the desire for immediate revenge. He felt no tremor of fury, no impulse to strike back in the night. Instead, he felt something far more dangerous. Focus, a shift within him, quiet and precise, like a lock clicking open. Humiliation was never the end of anything for Luciano. It was the beginning, the opening move in a deeper game only he could see. For him, silence was not weakness, it was architecture. In 1931, New York was a city split by more than streets and neighborhoods. Beneath its noise and ambition ran a deeper divide, one carved by origin, language, and the suspicions that grew in the spaces between them. Immigrant communities existed in a fragile balance, tolerated but never truly welcomed. Italian families, especially, lived under a gaze that judged them before they spoke a word. Prejudice was not something hidden in that era. It moved freely, wore a uniform, carried a badge, and patrolled the avenues with the confidence of a man convinced he was protecting a world that did not belong to the people he watched. White officers often treated immigrants less as citizens and more as intruders whose ambitions had to be kept in check. A nod from one officer could determine the fate of a shopkeeper. A glare could end any illusion of safety. For many Italian immigrants, the police represented not order but oppression, a system designed to remind them where they stood. Raids were common. Harassment was expected. Families grew accustomed to keeping their voices low, their papers close, and their children indoors at night. The law did not serve them, it stalked them. It was in this environment that the seeds of what would later be called the Mafia found their soil. It was not simply crime that shaped the underworld, it was the absence of protection. When the state turned its back on entire neighborhoods, men like Luciano learned to build their own structures of power, their own methods of justice, their own networks of survival, not as rebellion, but as adaptation. The officer who humiliated Luciano that night was not acting alone, even if he believed he was. He stood as a symbol of something larger, a system that tried to put men like Luciano in their place with a shove, a slur, a public display meant to diminish them. And for the most part, it worked. Immigrants learned to swallow their anger, to step aside, to hope the storm would pass quickly. But choosing Luciano as a target was a mistake born from ignorance. He was no reckless street brawler, no man blinded by pride. He lived in a different world, one built on strategy, alliances, and long-term vision. Around him, the Castellamarese War simmered, reshaping the very architecture of organized crime. Old powers were collapsing, new alliances were forming. The city stood on the edge of a transformation that no one fully understood yet. And in such a volatile moment, one small act, a humiliation delivered on a wet street, had the potential to shake far more than a man's dignity. It could disrupt an entire underworld. Everything was in a state of quiet eruption. One careless gesture was enough to start a tremor. In the hours that followed his public humiliation, Luciano did not retreat into anger. He did not confide in allies, nor summon his most trusted men for counsel. He simply continued his night as if nothing had disturbed its rhythm. But beneath that calm exterior, something precise had awakened, not fury, but clarity. Silence had always been his greatest discipline. He understood its weight better than most men understood violence. Silence created space. It pulled truth from the careless. It revealed the patterns others tried to hide. And now, it gave him the distance he needed to separate emotion from strategy. In the days that followed, Luciano did not pursue the officer who had shoved and degraded him. He pursued the world around him. He studied the man's connections, the merchants he intimidated, the whispers that followed him through the neighborhood. He watched, listened, and gathered the threads of a network far more valuable than the man himself. He moved through the city with unhurried grace, visiting cafes where old men argued in Sicilian dialect, walking through fruit markets scented with citrus and damp crates, stepping into barber shops where conversation flowed more honestly than anywhere else. He greeted people with a warm nod, asked quiet questions, absorbed every detail. While others mistook these small routines for leisure, Luciano was charting the architecture behind his humiliation, who protected the officer, who feared him, and who tolerated him out of necessity. The humiliation had not stirred vengeance in him, it had sharpened his focus. The insult had been public, yes, but the solution would unfold in private. Direct retaliation would be crude. It would draw attention, ignite conflict with the state, and dismantle the fragile balance he was working to reshape in the underworld. Precision, not passion, was what the moment demanded. He began to see how one man's arrogance relied entirely on the support of a small circle, a fragile structure held together by corruption, intimidation, and complacency. The officer walked with confidence only because others cleared the path for him. Remove the hands that held him up, and the man would collapse under the weight of his own character. To outsiders, it seemed as though Luciano had swallowed the insult, that he had chosen dignity over defiance, restraint over wrath. They whispered that perhaps the great strategist had finally been put in his place, but those who truly understood him, the few who had watched him rise from nothing, felt an unease growing quietly. They knew Luciano's silence was never surrender. It was preparation. The city believed the insult had ended on Mulberry Street. They did not understand the man they had provoked. The officer who humiliated Luciano believed the encounter had ended the moment he walked away smirking, satisfied with his performance. But his confidence rested on a fragile illusion, the belief that power belonged to him simply because a badge hung on his chest. What he did not understand was that Luciano never confronted an enemy directly when he could dismantle the ground beneath the man's feet. It began subtly. A merchant on the corner of Broome Street, long accustomed to slipping a few dollars into the officer's hand each week, suddenly forgot, not out of courage, but because someone else, someone far quieter, had paid him a visit days earlier. A reminder was delivered not through threats, but through reassurance. He no longer needed to fear the man in uniform. Another shopkeeper followed, then a fruit vendor, then a tailor whose windows had been cracked more times than he could count. Their fear began to shift, not toward the officer, but away from him. Power changes form when people stop believing in it. And Luciano understood this better than any lawman patrolling Mulberry Street. Informants who once whispered into the officer's ear grew silent too. They stopped answering questions, stopped acknowledging him at all. The small circle that had sustained his authority began to dissolve like fog under morning light. Luciano never spoke to them directly. He didn't have to. Influence moves through the city the same way water finds cracks, quietly, steadily, reshaping everything in its path. The officer noticed the change only when it began to choke him. His usual rounds no longer produced the easy bribes that had supplemented his income. Doors that once opened quickly in fear now closed before he reached them. People avoided his gaze rather than bow to it. A man accustomed to being acknowledged felt himself slipping into irrelevance. Then came the administrative pressure, the kind that does not shout, but suffocates. A complaint whispered into the right ear. A small report highlighted by a clerk who normally ignored such papers. A discrepancy in his accounts noted by someone who had never cared to look before. Luciano had identified the weak points in the officer's chain of protection and applied pressure so gently, so precisely, that no one could trace the shift back to its source. The officer tried to regain control, but corruption is a fragile shelter. Once cracks form, the entire structure collapses. His suspension arrived not with drama, but with indifference, a simple declaration that his conduct required review. He had humiliated a man in public. Now he was being erased in silence. Whispers moved through the neighborhood, half in awe, half in caution. Luciano had not lifted a hand, had not issued a threat, had not altered the calm expression that framed his thoughts. Yet the balance of the street had changed entirely. Power in his world was not taken by force. It was redefined, and the city learned a lesson it would not forget. Luciano never raised his voice. He simply rewrote the rules of the board. When the officer faded from Mulberry Street, stripped of influence, suspended from duty, and quietly abandoned by the very system he once believed invincible, something far larger than his downfall began to take shape. It was not merely a personal victory for Luciano. It was a demonstration of a new kind of power, one that broke from the traditions of the old world. In the early years of the American underworld, leaders often held their status by force alone. Violence was the answer to insult. Blood settled disputes faster than words. But that world was crude, fragile, and unsustainable, a world Luciano had long known would collapse under its own weight. His silent retaliation against the officer was more than revenge. It was proof of concept. People talked, quietly at first, then with conviction. Leaders in the Italian neighborhoods began to see Luciano differently. He was no longer just a rising figure, no longer merely a man with ambition and charm. His patience, his restraint, his calculated precision revealed something rare. A strategist capable of bending entire systems without ever appearing to touch them. It was this reputation, not myth, not fear, but respect sharpened by observation, that allowed him to take his next steps with unprecedented authority. The Castellamarese War still raged around him, tearing apart factions trapped in old rivalries. But the humiliation he endured on that wet night, and the silent storm he unleashed afterward, clarified something within him. The old order had no future. The downfall of one officer, insignificant to the city at large, served as a microcosm of a transformation about to sweep across the underworld. Luciano understood that true control came not from loud displays of dominance, but from the ability to remove power from others without drawing attention to himself. And he applied that principle far beyond Mulberry Street. He began to dismantle the outdated hierarchies that had ruled the Mafia for decades. He questioned loyalties that existed only out of fear. He broke down the idea that one family, one region, one tradition should dictate the fate of all others. In its place, he envisioned something far more stable, an organized structure that operated like a council, a network, an institution. It was the precursor to the Commission, then to the modern Mafia, a system where influence mattered more than ego, strategy more than impulse, and silence more than threats. The humiliation he suffered became a turning point, not because it wounded him, but because it revealed the limitations of every man who governed through fear. It validated the path he'd always believed in, a new kind of leadership, defined by subtlety and built for longevity. From that moment on, the Mafia began to walk toward a different future, one shaped not by anger, but by architecture. Night returned to Manhattan with the same quiet heaviness that had witnessed the beginning of everything. The rain never stayed away for long in this city. It always found its way back to the rooftops, the alleys, the fractured pavement. And with it came the memories of what had unfolded in the shadows. People did not speak openly about the officer who vanished from his post, but they remembered. They remembered the way his arrogance once filled the street, and the way it suddenly evaporated without a sound. They remembered how the balance of Mulberry Street shifted, almost imperceptibly, as if someone had turned a dial they were never meant to see. And they remembered Luciano, not because he boasted, not because he retaliated with fury, but because he did nothing that could be pointed at and everything that could be felt. The city had witnessed countless acts of violence, but very few acts of power executed with such restraint. What might have ended in another headline soaked in blood instead transformed into something far more enduring, a demonstration of control so sophisticated that even the wind seemed to carry its echo. A public humiliation could have ignited a feud. It could have drawn blood, demanded retribution, sparked a war no one could contain, but Luciano chose silence, and in doing so, he reshaped the meaning of strength. The truth settled into the city like mist. A man who commands himself commands others. A man who does not rush controls the pace of the world. In 1931, a policeman attempted to diminish Lucky Luciano. Instead, he diminished his own career. And the underworld gained the strategist who would redefine it.